Welcome, welcome. Welcome to the Hamill Family Lecture, The Truth Matters, featuring Amanda Knox. I am so thrilled that we have Ms. Knox joining us this evening. I'm sure that many of us have read about Ms. Knox's wrongful conviction in the Italian courts, but what a difference it will be to hear Ms. Knox tell her own story. The Hamill Family Professor of Law and Social Psychology at the University of San Francisco, Dr. Richard Leo, will be introducing Amanda Knox, and it is my pleasure to introduce Dr. Leo to you. Dr. Leo is an internationally renowned expert on police interrogation practices, false confessions, and wrongful convictions. It is impossible for me to do justice to Dr. Leo's long list of accomplishments in the brief time I have allotted, because the list is just too long. Dr. Leo has published more than 100 articles in leading scientific and legal journals, as well as 7 books, with many of those publications translated into multiple languages, and several of them earning literary prizes. The Wall Street Journal named Dr. Leo as among the law professors most cited by United States appellate courts, which shows that while tens of thousands of academics read and rely on his publications, those publications also make a difference in actual decisions and in actual lives. Professor Leo has been awarded numerous career and lifetime achievement awards for his contributions to the study of social problems, criminology, psychology, and related fields, and his professional honors and awards are so numerous that his curriculum vitae does not list them all. Dr. Leo acts as an expert witness and consultant in cases involving false confessions and wrongful convictions. And in doing that, he puts his expertise to practice in the service of justice, which is what USF law is all about. In fact, we will be announcing soon that last week, our racial justice clinic, under the leadership of Professor Laura Bazelon, secured the release of a wrongfully convicted client in New Orleans after 2 years of representation and 8 years of the client serving in jail, in prison. We are so privileged to have Dr. Leo on our faculty here at the USF School of Law and delighted that he occupies the prestigious Hamill Family Chair. I would like to thank Jan and Steve Hamill for their generosity in establishing the Hamill Family Chair and in giving generously to the law school and university for more than 40 years, since just after Steve's graduation from USF Law. Steve and Jan have contributed to scholarships, fellowships, the renovation of Kendrick Hall, and the building of our beautiful Zeef Library. And they established the Hamill Family Endowed Chair to, quote, support a person who is distinguished in law and exemplifies the ideals and values articulated in the university's vision, and who recognizes the importance of advancing justice and ethics in his or her teaching and scholarship. And that's Richard Leo. Jan and Steve, your generous investment in the law school enables us to make a difference, not only in the lives of our students, but in our greater society through the inspiring and impactful work of Dr. Richard Leo. Thank you for the Hamill Family Chair, which also supports this thought-provoking annual lecture series where we host conversations on the most pressing topics in criminal justice today. And thank you, Professor Leo, for all that you do. Now, please join me in welcoming Professor Richard Leo.
Thank you, Dean Freewald. I want to thank Dean Freewald, under whose successful leadership of the law school we recently posted an 81% bar pass rate. I think if we were doing this in person, we'd all be giving her a standing ovation. It would not have happened without her hard work and the reforms that she instituted and the way in which she inspires faculty and students to do better, both on intellectual things, but also on very practical things in the study of law and in preparation for being a lawyer and for passing the bar exam. So my hat is off to Dean Freewald. And I also wanted to, before introducing Amanda Knox, I just want to thank the Hamills, as always, for being such generous people and generous supporters, not only of this chair, but of the law school and of the success, the ongoing success, enduring success of the law school, and most importantly, of our law students, future lawyers dedicated to the ethical practice of law, as well as to making society a better place. So it's my great pleasure to introduce Amanda Knox. Amanda Knox, I invited Amanda Knox to give this talk prior to the pandemic. And so the talk was delayed by about 6 months. And I was going to assign Amanda Knox's book, Waiting to Be Heard, in my interrogation and confession seminar. So it was going to be paired with what we were talking about in the seminar. And prior to teaching that seminar for the last 15 years at USF, I've taught a seminar on the wrongful conviction of the innocent. And Amanda Knox's case, as I'm sure she will discuss, raises lots of interesting questions about wrongful convictions and about interrogations and confessions in particular. So I want to just make a couple comments about that, about her case, and then I want to segue to Amanda Knox and what she's been doing since her exoneration. So what is striking from a scholarly perspective about Amanda Knox's wrongful conviction is that this is not a case where there is any doubt about Amanda's innocence. There is a ton of DNA at the crime scene that absolutely links to the true perpetrator of the crime and that absolutely exonerates her. If this had happened in America and Amanda Knox had been exonerated by Peter Neufeld and Barry Scheck of the Innocence Project, her exoneration would be as strong as any of the 400 individuals who have been exonerated by innocence projects across the country in the last 30 years. And looking at her case, as I'm sure she will talk about, it has many of the classic aspects of wrongful convictions in America: botched police interrogation, tunnel vision and confirmation bias, coerced false confession, and naive and vulnerable subject. So the question is, well, why then do so many people still think, or did so many people think, that Amanda Knox was guilty? And if you watch the Netflix documentary, the journalist Nick Pisa, who is on the documentary, basically says, well, we had to get these stories. We had to sensationalize it. We couldn't be bothered with double checking or getting the facts right because we might lose the scoop. And so it's always been a curiosity to me why a case that never should have been prosecuted, that is so clear, gained such international fame. And unfortunately for Amanda, of course, she was wrongfully convicted, I believe not once, but twice, spent 4 years in an Italian prison before being acquitted, not once, but twice, and ultimately declared factually innocent by the Italian Supreme Court. Now, since her release in 2011, Amanda Knox has done a lot. And one of the reasons I admire Amanda Knox is because, having spent many years studying and working with and even writing books on the wrongful conviction of the innocent, a lot of people who are wrongfully convicted just move on to other things. Amanda Knox has done a lot to educate the world about wrongful conviction, gender and wrongful conviction, to try to make the world a better place and to help reform the criminal justice system. In addition to writing her book, she's been a journalist for the West Seattle Herald. She hosted on Facebook Watch the Scarlet Letter reports, which examined the gendered nature of public shaming of women. With her husband, Chris Robinson, who is going to join us in the question and answer, she hosted 5 seasons of the podcast, The Truth About Crime, and is now hosting an even more interesting podcast in its first season called Labyrinths. I would encourage everyone to subscribe to that. She has written about a number of topics on wrongful convictions, including gender and wrongful convictions. And as I mentioned earlier, she is committed to criminal justice reform, not only educating people about the problem of the wrongful conviction of the innocent, but also about the many other problems that our criminal justice system faces. So it's with great pleasure that I introduce to you Amanda Knox.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate the opportunity to be here. I'm honored to be here, asked by Professor Leo, because he's such a rock star in the criminal justice world. It's pretty fabulous to be able to be recognized by him and to share the stage with him. Thank you for having me. So, we're all here to talk about wrongful convictions and whether or not the truth matters. And what I have found is, first of all, a few things. My case, one could argue, is pretty extraordinary for a number of reasons. One of the major ones is that I'm not your typical exoneree, right? I am a young woman. I come from a socioeconomic, privileged background. I'm not the kind of person who you would think would be obviously vulnerable to the criminal justice system. Um, that said, oh, and also this case became an international phenomenon that took over, you know, a lot of the tabloid media for a good decade. Um, and Meanwhile, there are a bunch of wrongfully convicted people whose stories just get swept under the rug and no one ever hears about them. They don't get, you know, a Netflix documentary, or if they do, it's very rare. So we're talking about like this weird case where for some reason there is a ton of interest in this case in particular, and in at its sort of focal point, me. Um, okay, why is that? Well, the reason for that actually sort of comes down to a lot of the problems with any wrongful convictions case. The first and foremost one, that focus was steered away from where it should have been focused. So not only was the victim of this crime, Meredith Kircher, my roommate, my friend of several weeks, um, the sort of ongoing investigation into the truth of what the horrible thing that happened to her was swept under the rug for the sake of a story. And the true center of this story of what happened is someone who, despite the international attention that this case has received, goes largely unrecognized. And that is Meredith's killer, Rudy Gaudet. So a note about Rudy Gaudet and you know being the person who should have been recognized as being the sort of force that happened in this case. He was a troubled guy, like many young men who are coming from a he didn't have a lot of support in his life. He was in the weeks leading up to the crime, he was breaking and entering into people's houses. He was on a burglary spree. He had been known to be wielding a knife. Um, and that is leading up to him showing up at our apartment one night and Meredith being the only one who happened to be there when he did. He ultimately fled the country immediately after the crime occurred. And when he fled, he left his DNA all over the crime scene, all over Meredith's body. He left his fingerprints and footprints in her blood. And he was eventually found guilty of this crime. He was arrested in Germany. He was put on a fast track trial, sentenced to 30 years, which were later reduced to 16 years on appeal. And again, like the surprising thing about this case is for how famous it is, very few people have ever heard of him. And that is because of another factor that factors into wrongful convictions cases. The police and the prosecution made a mistake. They they were under pressure by the media. So, in the immediacy of this crime occurring and its discovery, there were television cameras across the street taking video of the crime scene as the police were showing up in their, in their gear. Um, the Italian authorities were under immense pressure to solve this case fast because here we are in this beautiful countryside town that's known for its tourism and its student population. And suddenly, this student is found raped and murdered. It's a terrible, horrific crime that crosses national boundaries. It is horrific and also tantalizing to the tabloid media. So the Italian authorities have a lot of pressure on their backs to solve it immediately, and they've developed a theory based upon investigative intuition. This is their words, actually. They had investigative intuition, also gut instinct, that was not guided by any particular piece of evidence because honestly, by the time that they were making arrests 4 days later, they didn't really have access to a lot of evidence. They were still gathering evidence at that point. Um, and what ended up happening is they targeted me, one of Meredith's roommates, and my boyfriend of 5 days, who happened to be my alibi for the evening. Why did they target us? Well, there's a lot been said about how I behaved badly or I behaved in ways that were not usual. I stuck out like a sore thumb for whatever reason. I call bull on that. I think that's a really convenient retroactive thing that a lot of the police say. I think what ended up being a major factor in them choosing me over anyone else, like my other roommates, for instance, was that I was the most vulnerable. So my other two roommates were legal students. They worked at law offices. They had representation at the time. I did not. Um, I was the first person to alert the police that there was something wrong at my house that ultimately led to the discovery of the crime scene. So, of course, as the first person to discover the crime scene and to call the police, I was targeted. Um, and you know, what ended up happening is that I spent every day after we discovered Meredith's body at the police station, hours and hours and hours a day, telling them anything I could possibly think of that could help them. And this was despite the fact that I was getting calls from my mom telling me to come back home to the United States. I wasn't safe. Um, Family members in Germany telling me, come and stay with us until this is all figured out. There's a killer on the loose. We don't know if this killer is targeting your house and maybe they're looking for you. Like, we don't know. There was not enough information to know. Meanwhile, I'm thinking, "Oh my gosh, if I had been home that night, I could be dead right now." But maybe I have access to some knowledge that would help really crack this case. This is what the police were telling me. We need you here, Amanda, because you're the first person to arrive home. You knew Meredith the best out of all of your roommates. Maybe there's just some interaction that you witnessed at one point while you guys were out dancing or when you were, out having dinner and somebody looked at her in the wrong way. Maybe that is going to be the secret that is going to crack this case. So I'm sitting there for hours and hours and hours with these police officers answering the same questions over and over and over again. After on the fifth day, after gosh, um, it it was an obscene number of hours that I was ultimately questioned over those um, 5 days, but I was being recorded at all times leading up to that. I didn't know that. I didn't know that they had tapped my phones, or my cell phone. I didn't know that every time I went to the police station and they brought me into a room to ask me questions, that they were recording everything. I had no idea because I thought I was just, like they said I was, a witness. Um, the final night that they brought me in, they didn't actually bring me in. They brought my boyfriend in. They called him in. It was 11 p.m. at night. And because I was afraid to be alone anywhere, I mean, my roommate had just been murdered when she was at home alone. I accompanied him to the police station. And while they were questioning him, I was in the waiting room, minding my own business, doing my homework, honestly, when a police officer came up and asked me what I was doing. And I said I was doing homework, waiting for Raffaele to come out. Um, and he said, "Well, if you're here, you might as well be answering questions. So let's bring you inside and get you into a room." And that's where everything went haywire. Um, Both Raffaele and I were subjected to extremely coercive interrogation techniques over the course of that night in order to break us. They already had a head start on Raffaele, screaming at him, lying to him, telling him that he was never going to see his family again, denying him the right to access to a lawyer. Um, and they started in on me maybe an hour after they started in on him. Um, the There were threats of physical and psychological violence. I was ultimately told that after I had been told that everything that I had ever said to them was a lie and was wrong, that either I was lying to them or that I had amnesia. And I had witnessed something so traumatic and horrible that I forgot it. And I had rewritten my memories to remember something completely different. Now, I know that this sounds crazy and that like who would ever be open to that kind of suggestion, but when you are being yelled at after 53 hours of interrogation over 5 days in a foreign language that you understand about as well as a 10-year-old, um, for hours and hours and hours with the legal authority of people who are twice your age telling you that you're wrong and you're never going to see your family again unless you tell them everything you know, and they know that you witnessed something, so you better tell them what it is. I started to believe them. I started to believe them that the only reason that they could be treating me that way was because I must have witnessed something and I didn't remember it. I was too traumatized. And so what the police did is they went and took my cell phone. My mom was calling me meanwhile. She was on her way to Italy, and they knew that because they had tapped into my phones. They, in fact, interrogated me that night, knowing that my mom was arriving the very next day. Um, and they combed through my phone until they found a text message between me and my boss at the time, a man named Patrick Lumumba. They wanted to know who Patrick Lumumba was. They interpreted my last text message to him to mean that I had made an appointment with him the night of the murder. What I had actually written to him was, "Okay, have a good night. See you later," translated directly into Italian. Um, they don't say "see you later" the same way that we do here in English, but I did not know the correct translation, so they interpreted my direct translation of "see you later" to mean I will literally see you later tonight when you commit this murder, basically. So they wrote statements and had me sign them and told me that I was a, a really important witness. Of course, within hours, I recanted those statements. I said, "This is not true. I feel like this is not what I remember. I can't go in front of a jury and say that I saw this or witnessed this. I don't have that." They told me, "Don't worry. Your memories will come back later. You're just confused." Meanwhile, they're going to take me to someplace special, some safe house for my own protection. That's what led to my arrest. I was stripped naked, photographed. I was put in handcuffs the entire time, thinking this was all some sort of necessary part of being a witness, because that's what they told me. And I was taken to prison, where I was put into an isolated cell. I didn't have access to anything related to the outside world. No TV, no newspapers, no phone calls, no access to attorneys, for 3 days. And there I waited, wondering if my mom knew where I was, if she thought I was dead, if there was any way to get a message to her. And all of that is a horrible, traumatic experience, but one that a lot of exonerees have experienced before. Um, this is the work that Professor Leo has dedicated himself to, this kind of breaking of a person, because there's no more powerful evidence in court than some kind of false confession or false admission by an innocent person, because no one thinks that innocent people would ever say anything that would incriminate themselves. Um, Another really big aspect of my case that's super standard across the board. Um, from the moment that they arrested me and they had their sort of theory in mind, the police and the prosecution pursued their investigation based upon that premise. Amanda's guilty, she's involved somehow. And so all exonerating evidence was written off or ignored. So the fact that I had no history of criminal behavior or violence, I had no relationship or even special knowledge of who the killer was. Like, I didn't know Rudy Gaudet. I knew that some dude played basketball with our neighbors, but I didn't know who he was. I didn't have his phone number. I didn't know his name. Um, and there was no DNA of me at the crime scene. I lived in this house, so there was DNA of me in the house, but Meredith had been murdered in her room, and there was no traces of me in her room. All of that was written off. Well, Amanda just didn't happen to, Amanda cleaned up her traces of DNA and left all the DNA of the other guy. That's why her DNA isn't there. Um, you know, which, as we all know, is impossible. Um, so that was ignored, and a bunch of incriminating evidence was manufactured out of whole cloth. So what are we talking about? There was a lot said about a knife that was retrieved from my boyfriend's house at the time, a chef's knife that I had used in cooking at his house. So my DNA was definitely on the handle. It was said that there was a trace amount of Meredith's DNA on the blade. And for the longest time, my defense experts fought long and hard with the prosecution's forensic experts to gain access to the raw data, by which they came to that conclusion. And the prosecution fought every step of the way to refuse us access to that information. Indeed, they tried to refuse that information to the independent experts who were called in on appeal. Um, at all times, they were trying to just say, trust our conclusions, don't question our methodology. Um, the prosecution put forth this theory that it was some kind of sex game gone wrong. At various times, it was stated that it was satanic in nature, or that it had to do with drug use, or that it had to do with, um, the major one that they put forth was jealousy. So the idea being, and this was put into the mouth of like this was put into my mouth by my prosecutor. During closing arguments, he described how I was telling Meredith how she was such a pure and honest girl and I was going to corrupt her because I'm an adulteress. And, I was called Luciferina, the girl with the face of an angel, but the soul of a devil. Um, it was claimed that I did this not because I had a history of violence or any interest in violence, but that one night I just decided to do evil for the sake of evil. And I was given a nickname, Foxy Noxy. This nickname was taken from my social media, and it's actually a nickname that my soccer teammates gave me way back when I was a kid, because I would, based upon how I would bound around the soccer field and because it rhymes with Knox, as Professor Leo noticed in the introduction. um, and that character became the focal point of this whole case. It wasn't about the evidence, it was about the character. Who is this girl? What kind of sex games was she into? Was she into devious sex? What kind of sex toys did she have? Was she fighting with Meredith? Do we have any knowledge of that? Of course not. Well, of course, they're girls, they're going to fight. And all the time that my trial was going on, it took 2 years for the entire thing to play out before I received a verdict. So 2 years that I spent in prison waiting, believing that no matter what people were saying out there in the world, out there in the media, what mattered was the truth. So, yes, was there horrible lies being said about me? Absolutely. Was there false evidence being presented in court? Absolutely. Was I totally ill-equipped to defend my character in this way? Yes. But ultimately, I believed that the court is like a scientific laboratory where a whole bunch of information gets boiled down to truth beyond a reasonable doubt. And so for those 2 years leading up to my verdict, I was actually optimistic. I was sad, I was stuck in prison, but I was waiting to go home. And this is what my family told me again and again and again. We're in a tunnel, but there is a light at the end of this tunnel because the truth matters. And so I had faith that my innocence would ultimately prevail, that somewhere along the line there had been a huge misunderstanding, but that ultimately, when it all came down to it, I didn't do this. So I was going to go home with my parents. Um, the night I received my verdict was December 4th, 2009. And it was in the middle of the night because the jury had deliberated all day. And my mom bought me a coat to wear. She bought me a green coat because she thought it was lucky. And I remember going into the courtroom, and the first thing I noticed was every time I went into the courtroom leading up to that day, the courtroom was madness. It was packed with people, not just with our attorneys and with their staff, but with paparazzi and media just filling the space as much as they possibly could. And whenever I walked into the room, they flashed their cameras at me and shouted questions at me, and I had to be sort of carried basically in between these two guards and brought over to my lawyers. And this time, the courtroom was quiet. It was still packed, but it was quiet. Everybody was silent. No one said a word to me. And I was brought in to stand between my lawyers. And one of them, Luciano, grabbed my hand, and he told me coraggio, courage. And my entire family was there. They were all behind my lawyers, waiting to hear the verdict, even though they didn't understand a word of Italian. So they were really relying on having the word passed to them. Um, and then the court secretary announced La Corte. The judge and the jury filed in, and the judge started reading my verdict. And it's so bizarre. I remember how I didn't even really hear the words that he was saying. Um, all I heard was someone behind me say, "No," a second before I heard him pronounce colpevole, guilty. I didn't hear him sentence me to 26 years. I heard ringing in my ears from then on. I heard the sounds of my family crying. I was crying. Um, and I was carried out of that courtroom and back into that prison van and back to the prison, um, trying to understand what had happened to me. This was an existential crisis. What had just happened was that I had proof that the courtroom is not a scientific laboratory, but it is a battleground of storytelling where the most truthful story cannot win against a more compelling story. And the compelling story that won that day was of Foxy Knoxy, my doppelganger, the fictional version of me that was the ice queen with the ice eyes and the murderous adultery whore that had captured everyone's imagination. And suddenly my reality had been rewritten, my past, my present, and my future. So not only was I stripped of my promised freedom that day, I was stripped of my identity. I was no longer a lost tourist waiting to be allowed to go home. I was a prisoner. And when I arrived back at the prison, I realized that the prison was my home. Um, Hopefully, no one here has spent time in prison. I don't recommend it. Um, but it was an eye-opening experience for me. Um, I think the thing that every prison is different, and so there are going to be different traumas depending on where you're at. But the thing that is absolutely common to the prison experience is losing your humanity, because you lose your right to a sense of privacy and bodily autonomy and human potential. Um, and when I realized that this was not just a place that I was by accident, that this was a place that the rest of society had deemed I needed to be, I, of course, thought about suicide, because what was this life that I was living? It certainly wasn't the life that I expected I was going to live. I thought I was going to go to school and learn how to speak a foreign language and work as an interpreter and be a bridge builder between cultures. Um, and so I spent a decent amount of time thinking about how I would do it. It's tricky. You don't have access to a lot of things that you do on the outside world. Um, but I sort of settled on, if I did do it, I would try to um, cut my wrists in the shower. and hopefully not be found in time. But of course, this was a choice that was in my mind as a possibility. Um, Not because I felt like somehow my life was over, but because I didn't know what kind of ground to stand on anymore. If the truth didn't matter, then what fight was I in? What How do I convince people that this is wrong if the truth doesn't matter? Everything that I had thought I could do or count on was gone. Well, almost. I still had my family. Um, and of course, I carried this great fear that I was going to grow old without them. I was already missing milestones. I thought about how after 26 years, I would emerge from prison barren. Meanwhile, this was impacting my family tremendously. They were strained financially, emotionally, psychologically. One of my sisters dropped out of school. Another one of my sisters started getting into fights with kids at school when they called her Amanda. Um, and my youngest sister, who was 8 at the time that I went into prison, um, she started having daily panic attacks. My mom totally stopped eating. Um, it's not just the person who is at the center of a wrongful conviction who's impacted, but there are ripple effects that are deep and scarring for everyone that is around them. Um, my family did everything they possibly could to be close to me in this time. And it was difficult because not only was I halfway across the world, but I was only allowed 10 minutes of a phone call once a week. And I was only allowed 6 hours of visitation a month. And every time it was for an hour at a time. So my family never missed a single visitation hour. And that meant that someone in my family was in Italy at all times during my incarceration, 4 years. It was an incredibly lonely time for any person who was visiting me because they would very likely be alone. They'd take time off work and they'd spend weeks alone in a foreign country waiting for the next hour that they could see me. And of course, I tried to make those hours count. They were the only time that I had with the people that reminded me of my real life. And I remember this one time my dad came to visit me. It was not that long after I had been convicted. And I was still grappling with the idea that the truth didn't matter and I didn't know what was going to become of me if there was any hope. And usually when I went to visitation, I tried really hard to be upbeat. I tried really hard to tell my dad what I had accomplished in the days between our visitations, how many sit-ups I was doing, and how many letters I wrote, what books I was reading. But this one time I just really couldn't pull it together. I was having a really bad day. And my dad was there in the visitation room. And as soon as I saw him, I immediately started crying. He embraced me, he held me, and I begged him to save me. I did that knowing that he was just as helpless as I was. And yet I didn't, I, so when I said that to him, my dad started crying. And that's when I knew how bad of trouble I was in. because I had never seen my dad cry before in my entire life. Um, and the next 2 years of me being on trial were very much defined by a new sort of emotional and psychological default setting. I was sad. I woke up sad. I went to bed sad, um, which was unusual for me because I've tended to always be an upbeat kid. And my mom, who's ever the optimist, was just telling me, no, don't give up. Don't lose heart. We're going to fight this to the end. There's a light at the end of this tunnel. We just have to keep fighting. We just didn't know how long this tunnel is. However long it takes, we're going to get you out of there. And the thing was that I wasn't sure of that anymore. I had no proof that there was light at the end of the tunnel anymore. If the truth matters, then what is the light at the end of the tunnel? Like, I had to instead embrace uncertainty, the fact that I didn't know if I was ever going to get out. Even as my appeal was going on, and my appeal was going on, like it took a year for my appeal to start, and then a full year for my appeal to progress in the courts. And my appeal was going well. Independent experts came in that totally called into question everything that the police had done, especially in their forensic work. And all the while, I kept thinking, I don't know if anyone cares what the truth is. So I don't know what the outcome of this case is. And I was afraid to hope. So while I hadn't given up on the fight for my innocence, I had given up on the assumption that innocence means freedom, that the story of my innocence could ever trump the story of a guilty whore. And I also knew that even if I were legally vindicated, there was no guarantee that anyone would ever truly believe me, that anyone would ever truly question the Foxy Noxy narrative. Over that time, I did a lot of what I now recognize as mindfulness training, um, which was taking each moment for itself at a time, one day at a time, one moment at a time, starting over whenever I felt too weak or too angry or too stuck. I did a lot of talking to my younger self. I imagined a version of myself who hadn't yet gone through what I was going through. And I tried to big sister her through the experience as a way of guiding myself through my sadness. Um, and after 2 years, I was acquitted. So my wrongful conviction was overturned. And it turns out the truth did matter, at least a little, insofar as forensic experts came in and called into question everything the prosecution said about the DNA evidence in my case. But what preceded me into the world was a doppelganger version of me, Foxy Noxy. And as I came back into the world of freedom, I found that I was being held to an impossible standard of femininity, of normalcy. I was so thoroughly misrepresented in court that there was nothing I could do that wasn't seen through the lens of Foxy Noxy. And what I found was that the controversy continued to matter more than the truth, that people were more interested in the controversy of Amanda Knox than they were of who I really was. Um, so one legal note. In Italy, the double jeopardy doesn't work the same way. Both defense attorneys and prosecutors can appeal verdicts. And in my case, my prosecutor appealed my verdict, my acquittal. My acquittal was overturned. I was put on trial again. I was found guilty again. And I spent 4 years not knowing if I was going to be sent back to Italy. I didn't know if I was making plans to turn myself into the police here in Seattle, hoping that they would let me serve out my sentence here in the United States so it wasn't such a hardship on my family. Meanwhile, I'm going to school. I'm at college. I'm I'm living a double life where my life is still on edge. I'm in limbo. I can't plant roots. I can't get a job. I can't trust anyone, but I'm free. Um, and that went on until 2015 when the Supreme Court in Italy overturned my second conviction, acquitted me per non aver commesso il fatto, for not having committed the crime. They found me what is the Italian legal equivalent of factually innocent. And that was a tremendous relief. I remember not expecting that because it is astounding for the Supreme Court in Italy to make that kind of decision. Usually, what they'll do is if they don't like a decision that was made by a court, they'll send it back to a lower court to be retried again. So, best case scenario, I was thinking was that I would get another trial. I was not expecting for them to overturn it and then just put an end to the whole situation right there and then. So suddenly I went from hunted prey animal who had been living the last 8 years of my life at the mercy of this axe that was hanging over my head to an actual free person, someone who was not being hunted down anymore, who was free. And I wasn't being hunted down anymore by the courts. But I have continued to be hunted down by the society at large. I found that, like many wrongfully convicted people, I tend to be defined by the crime that I'm associated with, even though I have nothing to do with it. I found that I continue to be vilified in the media, um, accused of not showing enough remorse in relation to the crime, despite the fact that I'm innocent. Um, I'm constantly compared to Meredith, the victim of this crime, by people who seem to think that there can only be one victim of this crime, and that I, as a secondary victim of the crime, couldn't be a victim of the criminal justice system. I've been told that people are tired of hearing from me, that I should just be grateful that I'm not in prison and that I should disappear, which is quite the world to exist in when I, the last thing I wanted to be ever in my life was the girl who was accused of a murder she didn't commit. I came home to a world that didn't want me to go back to the life that I had before, that life didn't exist for me anymore. I had I tried for a while to just go back to my old life until I realized that the world had changed and I had changed with it. And the only thing that made sense for me now was to understand what I had gained from this experience. And what I had gained was a stunningly new perspective about the world that I never would have had access to before. I didn't know what prison was like. I didn't know what the criminal justice system was like. All of these issues were the farthest thing from my mind because, once again, this crime was not a part of my life. I grew up in the suburbs. I was a poetry nerd. I was doing yoga. This was not my world. I was fortunate that this was not my world, and I also thought that it would never be something that I would encounter. And I felt terribly alone coming home because I didn't know anyone else who had gone through what I went through. And it wasn't until my mom, who had been in contact with some people from the Innocence Project, told me that I didn't have a choice. I was coming with her down to Portland for the Innocence Network conference. The last thing I wanted at that time in my life was to walk into a room full of hundreds of people who would recognize me and know my name. I knew what that experience was like. It came with judgment and it came with weird, like, people being pushy and weird and cruel. And that was the last thing that I needed at that time. But my mom promised me that it was going to be good for me. So we went, and it was in a hotel. Like, everyone was gathering in one of those, basement ballrooms with the bad lighting and the bad carpet. And I was shaking, I remember. But my mom sort of pushed me through the doors into this ballroom. And immediately, these two men came up to me and they embraced me and they said, "You don't have to explain a thing, little sister. We know." And these were two men who had each spent over a decade in prison for crimes that they didn't commit. This was a room full of hundreds of people who had spent way longer in prison for crimes that they didn't commit. Mostly men, mostly disenfranchised, impoverished men who I never would have encountered in my world. And they became my family. And I realized that the one thing that I had was the ability to build a bridge between this community and the community of people who had no idea that any of this happened or mattered. People like me before it happened to me, which is why I've turned my world and my career and my life towards making these stories known and accessible to people. I know that there's a ton of attention on my case, and it's not the most egregious case in the world. I think it's pretty egregious, but it's not the most egregious case in the world. And I didn't lose 40 years of my life to prison, but all of the same mechanisms that happened to me happened to tons of people before me, and unfortunately are still happening to tons of people after me. And if I can build a bridge between them and the people who don't know or wouldn't think to care before, that is something that I feel is worthwhile. That is a way that I can rebuild my identity on my own terms, not constantly in reaction and in conversation to this crime that I had nothing to do with. That's what I do today with both the podcasts that I do, The Truth About True Crime and Labyrinths. And actually, I speak more in depth about my case on a lot of my episodes. I'm constantly trying to build those bridges and make connections and empathize and do for others what the media didn't do for me, which was open the floor to someone to have their own voice that is heard with compassion and nuance and without judgment. Um, and I'm similarly looking into cases and the ongoing processes that lead to mass incarceration and over sentencing in my reporting, especially at crimestory.com. And that's where I'm at. I'm happy to take questions about my case if anyone's interested, or other specific issues that are more broad, because honestly, what I've found is that my story opened, or my experience opened me up to a world of realities that I did not have access to before. And now I just spend all of my time learning and thinking about and writing about and sharing these realities. So I'm happy to speak to any of that as well.
Thank you, Amanda Knox, for that wonderful, wonderful, wonderfully moving talk. I'm going to moderate the questions. We have about a half hour for questions. I was supposed to make an announcement at the beginning of the talk that I did not make. Let me just say before I do this that there are some questions queued up in the Q&A. So if people would like to ask questions, please enter them in the Q&A. I've already looked at some of them, and they're overlapping. So I will go through them and select the ones that stand out the most. Okay, so as you saw from the PowerPoint at the beginning, USF is sharing a recording of the Zoom webinar on its YouTube channel, but everyone by attending the session agrees that the content is protected by copyright laws and that USF strictly prohibited the recording or reproduction of the session, including through any apps or other devices or screenshots. So I know that message was made earlier. I just wanted to repeat it since I forgot to make it at the beginning of the session. Okay, and at some point I'm going to ask a couple of questions too. Again, thank you, Amanda, for a truly compelling and insightful and inspiring talk.
Oh, thank you.
And by the way, it was at one of the National Innocence Conference meetings that we first met many years ago. Okay, so some of these questions also may have been answered in part in your talk. So um, I think some of the questions were asked along the way. So one question is, has there been any acknowledgement by the Italian government of the errors of its system? Have they offered any compensation for your lost years and the damage done to you and your family?
So the answer to that is no. Um, my co-defendant and the boyfriend of 5 days, who was my um, alibi that night, he actually filed for wrongful imprisonment and tried to be recognized as a wrongfully imprisoned person, and was told that his actions during the course of the investigation. So basically, the fact that he signed, like, basically signed the statements that the police wrote down for him to sign, he misled the investigators and therefore was found responsible for his own wrongful conviction, and was found to not be meriting of wrongful imprisonment compensation. So he has not been compensated. I have not been compensated for my wrongful imprisonment. The one thing that I have continued to fight about was my interrogation. During my interrogation, I was denied my right to a lawyer, and I was physically and psychologically abused. I was slapped. And I brought my case to the European Court of Human Rights that did rule in my favor. They ruled that indeed my human rights had been violated, and that my interrogation was illegal. And I received a small amount of compensation for that. I think it was something like, I don't even remember. Mostly went to my attorneys. I think it was like $18,000. But I have in no way been recognized as a, wrongfully convicted person. And I still actually remain wrongfully convicted of slander in regards to my interrogation. So that has yet to be overturned. It's something that I'm still attempting to fight, but it costs a lot of money to be going through the court system. So it's not something that is easily accessible to me. Um, so No, I have not been compensated. I have not been apologized to. I was found innocent. And the idea that I get from a lot of people in Italy is that I got off lucky. So I should be grateful.
I should add, and Amanda knows this, of course, given her work on with the wrongfully convicted, but it's rare that victims of wrongful conviction are apologized to. We have mechanisms here for compensation, but it's rare that that the courts and the prosecutors and the police who are responsible for the wrongful conviction take responsibility for it, publicly acknowledge it, and apologize for it. Um, on this theme of governments, there's sort of two questions that some of the questions are converging on. People are interested both in what the US government and the embassy, if anything, did in your case to help you out. And people are also interested post conviction what your take is on progressive prosecutors in the United States.
Mm. Um, Great questions. And I want to also emphasize that you're right, Professor Leo, that absolutely what we find across the board is that wrongfully convicted people don't get acknowledgement for the crimes that they've been subjected to, basically. And very often it's this ongoing sort of tension between law enforcement that doesn't want to recognize fault. And definitely makes it so that there's never a sense of closure. Um, in terms of the government aspect of it, while I was on trial, while I was on trial and in Italy, representatives of the United States would come every 6 months or so to ask me about my rights as a prisoner. They wanted to make sure that I was getting fed, that I had access to my parents, as the number of hours that I was allowed to, but they weren't interfering with my case. Primarily, their biggest role at that time was that as soon as my mom arrived in Italy, they put her in touch with a lawyer who could speak English. And he became one of the two central lawyers in my case. So that was a big help because my mom landed in Italy to the news that I had been arrested and did not know what to do. But that's about it. They couldn't really do anything. Meanwhile, after I was acquitted the first time and released from prison, and I was on trial here in the United States, um, I did not know what the United States government would do for me. So technically, at any point, if I'm on US soil, I'm a US citizen, the US government can decide that they're not going to extradite me for whatever reason. But they do have an extradition treaty with Italy. And so the expectation would be that they would extradite me unless they wanted to suffer some kind of political loss. So again, it was very much a situation where I was at the mercy of the Italian courts. And, for all of my prosecutors blustering that the US was interfering and telling, Italy how to do its job, um, I was not reassured by anyone in our government that I was going to be safe.
Um,
Oh, and progressive prosecutors. Okay. RE progressive prosecutors. I'm actually really interested in this movement for progressive prosecutors. I don't think that, by definition, prosecutors are all corrupt. Crimes happen. In fact, I am an indirect victim of a crime. My friend was murdered. And as a result, someone murdered my friend and could have killed me. And that is a situation that needs to be addressed. Um, I do think that, and in fact, I've actually got quite a big piece that I've written coming out on crimestory.com about progressive prosecutors and the movement for progressive prosecutors who are trying to either curb the powers of the prosecutor's office, so to actually limit the powers of the prosecutor's office by not, by not prosecuting with gang enhancements or gun enhancements or 3 strikes, or the kind of progressive prosecutor who is wielding that immense power that they have, but quote, benevolently. It's really interesting to see that happen across the United States. We see DA Gascon in LA, or compared to like Dan Satterberg here in King County. And it's it's interesting to see how prosecutors are talking about the amount of power that they have and whether or not they should wield it. Some are willing to give it up, and some are not willing to give it up until there is a greater infrastructure for community accountability. So a number of progressive prosecutors who I speak to, who genuinely do want there to be, they want to address mass incarceration and they want to have the system be more fair, are yet saying, but the community has basically made all of its problems my problem, and these are the tools that I have to work with those problems. So until the community can take accountability and not like push through all of their problems to the prosecutor's office, like what do I do? Um, it is a very interesting question, but it's one that I think is a very, very crucial moment that we're at right now when we're talking about how do we fund these alternatives? And are we going to be pulling the funding from, like the police say, in order to finally fund these alternatives that we have been asking for so long? Anyway, I think there's a lot of work that needs to be done still. And, it's one thing for a prosecutor to say, I'm going to be a good prosecutor. And another thing for a prosecutor to say, I'm going to prove to you that I'm going to be a good prosecutor because I refuse to say, go for the death penalty, right? Like that's a very different thing. Um, and hand over their power to, you know, basically just say, I'm not going to wield the hammer of the law as much as I possibly could just because I can. So it's an interesting conversation that's happening across the country, and it's happening in different ways across the country, interestingly.
Thank you, Amanda. So I'm going to try to join a couple questions here. I should tell you in the Q&A, there are a lot of people thanking you for giving this inspiring talk.
Oh, thanks, everyone.
So I'm going to read this and then I'm going to join it very briefly to a second related question. Your case brings out many of the pathologies of the adversary system.
Yes.
The prosecution's indifference to truth, desire for quick convictions, you as the defense having in effect to prove your innocence, the behavior of the tabloids and the stereotyping of you without caring about the consequences in a dog-eat-dog atmosphere.
Mm-hmm.
Should we develop a better system in which compassion and nuance and concern for both you and the victim are primary and the focus of the investigation?
Mm-hmm.
And I want to join that to a question about restorative justice. Now, our own Laura Bazelon, who, as Dean Freewald mentioned, had an amazing reversal of a wrongful conviction in New Orleans this week, just did fabulous work on that case, has written a book about wrongful conviction and restorative justice. And I've promoted that book, but I haven't always been sure that wrongful convictions and restorative justice pair as well as restorative justice pairs with other aspects of our adversarial criminal justice system. So I want to join those two questions,
Mm-hmm.
the one on restorative justice and wrongful conviction, as well as and related to building a system with more compassion and nuance, if that would have made a difference.
Yeah. So I do think that if we had a less adversarial, less punitive criminal justice system, a lot of the incentive structures that lead to wrongful convictions wouldn't necessarily go away fully, but would be lessened. So there would be less of a stake like, the prosecution would have less of a incentive to build their case on their terms at whatever cost, regardless of the exculpatory evidence, if it was a system in which they didn't feel like their job was to just build the best case according to their guilt scenario that they possibly could. So I do think that a world in which we grapple with crime and real crime, like real people are hurt by crime, that addresses the needs of the victim in response, um, and that addresses the true causes of crime for the defendant, in its so it should be for the sake of finding truth. Truth should be fundamental to that. And when we're constructing opposing narratives, truth often gets destroyed, basically. It's reshaped into a black and white narrative to fit a certain outfit that either demonizes a person or not. And if we live in a world in which getting the maximum punishment is not what is considered justice anymore, but instead is a sort of understanding of what happened, why it happened, how do we fix this problem, how do we address the needs of the victim, how do we address the needs of the perpetrator. That is a world in which I think black and white narratives fail to compel because they don't actually address the reality of what are many times complicated situations that lead to crime in the first place. If you take, for instance, in my own case, we're talking about Rudy Gaudet, a transient kid who didn't have the support system that he needed. He was getting into drugs. He was losing control. He was breaking into people's houses. He was clearly a troubled kid and he needed more support in his social world than he had. He was isolated, he was angry, and he erupted one night. I and the result was a person died. And how could we have responded in a way that, first of all, how can we set up a society where that kind of situation is less likely to occur? And then how do we address the needs of this person that doesn't just involve, like, saying, well, your life is over because this person's life is over, and that's somehow going to make up for it. It doesn't. It, like, we think that it brings back a balance, and it really doesn't. So I think that if we divorce, the prosecutor's like career and promotions and things that he can get for like winning cases, and instead promote a world in which nuanced, complicated, difficult conversations are taking place, wrongful convictions are less likely to occur because people have less of a stake in those black and white narratives.
Thank you. And I want to thank all the people who've been asking questions. We still have about 7 minutes left for questions, and I'm not going to be able to get to all of them, but I'm trying to join them, and I think I will reserve the right, hopefully, to ask the last one. So I think these questions go together. There's a question about what you would advise young women traveling to Europe, and whether you yourself would go back to Europe, go back to Italy rather. And there's also a question which I hope connects about the comments you made about mindfulness and whether you're aware of more opportunities for mindfulness in the criminal justice system.
Okay, so I absolutely fully promote young women being able to travel to invest themselves in other cultures and other people. Of course, the world is a little more scary for us. We are more vulnerable. So that does mean that when we find ourselves at 18 years old or 20 years old in a new environment, that it's okay to ask for help and it's okay to follow us like a radar in your head that if you're just not feeling safe, remove yourself from the situation as much as you can. At the same time, that doesn't fully save people. Meredith was not out on the town in the middle of the night when she was sexually assaulted and murdered. She was at home, and that should not have happened to her. It was unfortunately a thing that can happen. I do think that the vast majority of times these things don't happen, fortunately, but there's no way to be safe 100%. Um, that isn't to say that these things don't happen here in the United States, however. So the idea that somehow you are particularly vulnerable abroad, the reason why you're particularly vulnerable abroad is because you don't have that same social network that you normally would. So don't be afraid to ask for help. The biggest thing that I regret was the feeling like, because I was a 20-year-old person and I was so important to help solve the case, that I couldn't ask for help. I just had to do what the police told me to do. And I didn't know that they were targeting me because it was so obvious to me that they would understand that I was innocent and had nothing to do with it. In terms of going back to Italy, I actually have gone back to Italy since all of this has happened. And that's a whole other crazy story that I couldn't possibly get into in the last 5 minutes that we have. But let's just say that the Italy Innocence Project, which did not exist while I was in prison, invited me to their first ever sort of public event presenting the idea of wrongful convictions to Italy. They invited me to speak about trial by media, and particularly how my case had been influenced by how the media presented it to the people of Italy. Um, and then the final part of that question was
Well,
mine.
it was a compliment to your coping strategy in a
Mhm.
foreign country, Italy, and then a question about whether there are opportunities for mindfulness that you're aware of in the criminal justice system.
So yes. So my coping mechanisms were very much sort of intuitive mindfulness, trying to be present, trying to make the best of what I had where I had it. So, in any given day, I had to make the choice to do what the best I could do in that moment at that time. So, if that was write a letter to my mom, that made that moment worth living. If that was do a bunch of sit ups, that made that moment worth living. And so it was a constant sort of choice to make life worth living by a simple step that could take 10 minutes, say. And then I would worry about the next 10 minutes later. Um, there are some things that I have seen in that are trying to bring mindfulness to the prison system, but it's really like hodgepodge volunteers who are putting forth ideas. For instance, I once worked to raise money for Yoga Behind Bars, which is a local group of basically just women who do yoga who were like, hey, we can do yoga with people who are in prison who are dealing with like emotional stress, and maybe it'll help them out. And so they organized this whole program and brought it to the prison system here in Washington State. But it's very much something that is happening by volunteers and people who are just trying to fill a need that they have. One thing that I think would be wonderful is, I use the Sam Harris Waking Up app. I would love it if people had access to those kinds of meditative apps while they were in prison. And I think Sam Harris recently made that free for prisoners in, I don't know what state, but I think he's been trying to bring that to the prison environment, or, anywhere that people can. It's just like, how do you have access to an app when you're in prison? Well, eh. Um, so I think that there are things that are happening, but again, it's very hodgepodge. It's very much at the will and mercy of people who are willing to step in and offer that service to their local place.
I'm going to exercise the prerogative of the moderator to ask the last question.
Okay.
I will say that I've heard Sam Harris say on his podcasts and in interviews that he makes his stuff available for free to anyone who asks, no questions asked.
Absolutely.
And I do know that there are a lot of cell phones that make their way into prisons. Um, so my question, Amanda, has to do with the Netflix documentary. I'm just
Mhm.
curious. Um, as with your talk, I found the Netflix documentary very compelling in a lot of ways. And I know you didn't have editorial control over the Netflix documentary. A lot of people, I think, have learned about your case through the Netflix documentary. People perhaps who weren't of a certain age then, or haven't read your book, for example.
Mhm.
Um, and at the same time, I was disappointed with the documentary, perhaps because it glossed over so quickly what you spent more time talking about today, which is the coercion, the psychological coercion, the 53 hours, the physical abuse, the threats, the way in which they got you to question your memory, doubt your memory, and believe them, and confess essentially to an alternative reality of their creating.
Yeah.
And so I wondered, I don't want to put you in the position of criticizing the documentary, but I wonder if you had a conversation with the documentarian today. I think maybe that was done 2 or 3 years ago, and you could suggest, it hadn't come out yet, and you could suggest doing anything differently, adding something to it, emphasizing something differently. If there was anything they got wrong that should have been emphasized differently, what that conversation would be like with the documentarian that tells
Yeah.
the story on Netflix.
Well, so the Netflix documentary that came out about my case came out in 2016. And this was, it was before all of their like 6-part docu-series getting into all the nitty-gritty with all of these cases. And I remember one of the sort of regrets of the filmmakers is they didn't get a 6-part series. They had like a 90-minute shot to like tell the story, this huge story about misconduct and forensic evidence and how the media played a role. And so there are a number of things that didn't make it into the cut, including very astutely um, everything that's involved with the interrogation process. And I think that remains one of the big key issues of controversy surrounding me and my case is I'm constantly attacked as being someone who lied to the cops and implicated an innocent person, and I must be a racist, I must be a liar, and there is little recognition that what happened to me during my interrogation is no different than what is happening in other false confessions that happen here in the United States, where I was lied to, I was abused, I was coerced, I signed statements that were written by the police themselves, not that I had written. And so we could have spent a whole episode of a 6-part docuseries talking about that interrogation and how they broke down both Raffaele and me. Um, in the way that they were able to do justice to that kind of thing with the Central Park Five or, these other cases. I do think there's also a really interesting factor that people don't know about, which is that my prosecutor was on trial for misconduct while he was prosecuting my case. So he was on trial for misconduct in a prior case, the Monster of Florence case, and that is an interesting, like the way that he conducted himself during that trial very much was mirrored in the way that he tried to, present me in his trial or in the trial against me. But for those who don't know, the Monster of Florence case, which he prosecuted back in the day, it was a cold case of a serial killer in Florence. And my prosecutor reopened this cold case on a lead that had to do with like cults and the Masons and Satanism and corpses that had been dug up and replanted and all of this crazy psychic evidence. And when two journalists started investigating his investigation into this case, he accused them of being the Monster of Florence, and he imprisoned one of them. And he was on trial for abuse of office while he was doing my case. So that's an interesting aspect of this case. And I think those are the two big ones that are major. But like I think the big thing that I've always regretted about the way that my case has been presented throughout the world, including in the Netflix documentary, is that it has always centered on me. So it's, called Amanda Knox, and the whole world made this case about Amanda Knox to the extent that, like, when Meredith's killer was released from prison after 16 years, or after 13 years, he got off a little early for good behavior. The headline was Amanda Knox's roommate's killer released. So at no point was his name mentioned, her name mentioned. Somehow I became the center, the focal point for this story that I had absolutely nothing to do with, and for which I was actually the agent of least cause. So of all the people who had power and agency in this equation, I was the one of the least people. So what I did actually had very little impact on what happened in this case. What the police were doing, what the killer did, what the prosecution was doing. All of these people were the ones who were really making this story happen, and I was just there for the ride. And so one thing that I would love is for ultimately this story to decenter me. And my way of like trying to decenter myself from that is to say, look, I have a crazy story. Like, no doubt I have a crazy story of what I went through, but it really isn't about anything I did. I feel like I'm more of a witness, just like everyone else who watched the Netflix documentary, of this crazy story that happened to a person named Amanda Knox, and she just happens to be me. And I saw it, I witnessed it from the inside out. So anyway, I have a whole actual episode of my podcast about this because I kind of got into an argument with Malcolm Gladwell. He like does this thing where like, and Malcolm Gladwell, great guy, did a great job discussing my case, really putting the facts at the forefront when he was discussing my case in his most recent book. But he still sort of decided that how the case played out hinged upon people's perceptions of me. And I sort of pointed back to him that, like, it could have been anyone. It wasn't me. I was just at the wrong place at the wrong time. And everyone's trying to find answers in my behavior and the look in my eyes. And they're not looking into the cognitive biases of the investigators or the incentive structures of the, adversarial system. They're not looking at the historic prejudice against young sexually active women. It's like there are a lot of factors that really played into what happened that had nothing to do with me. So if anything, that's how I think this story should have been told.
Well, I want to thank you. I got a private email just moments ago describing in capital letters the amazing and powerful talk that you gave and thanking us for putting it
Oh,
on. So I didn't get to all the questions. I tried to encompass as many of them as I could. Obviously, we're in this artificial Zoom format, but thank you so much, Amanda, and thank you to everyone for coming, and thank you again to the Hamills for making this possible. Good night, everyone.
thank you so much, everyone. Good night.